Every welfare check she took cost someone their life. I'm Alex Carter, crime reporter for the Sacramento Chronicle, and I'll never forget the midnight call that changed everything. The voice on the line was low and urgent. Bones. People buried. Backyard of 1426 F Street. No name. No callback. Just static, then a click. By 6:30 a.m., I was pulling up to the nondescript Victorian boarding house on F Street. The early morning haze hung heavy over Sacramento, blurring the wrought iron fence that boxed in what looked like any other ramshackle pensione, or boarding house, as locals called it. Neighbors in threadbare robes clustered on their porches, eyes wide with a mix of dread and morbid curiosity. A lone patrol car idled at the curb, its red and blue lights painting the asphalt in pulsing strokes. I ducked under the yellow crime scene tape and flashed my press badge at Detective Elena Ramirez, who stood guard by the side gate. She nodded curtly. "You're cleared in. We've got at least 6 sets of remains so far. 2 more under excavation." Her tone was tight, professional, just another day on the job for her, but I could see the weight behind her dark eyes. Inside the yard, forensic teams crouched around shallow pits on the lawn, instruments glinting in the weak sun. A coroner's van idled at the driveway, its rear door open like a cavern of clinical dread. I approached a knotted mass of disturbed earth where a medical examiner carefully lifted a femur from the soil. White gloves stained pink with rust-colored residue. She placed it tenderly in a numbered evidence bag. Beside her, a pair of plaster molds captured a boot tread and a child's small footprint, splayed wide, an eerie echo of lives snuffed out. I snapped photos of the scene, the row of planters turned into graves, the muddy stumps of what had been flower beds, and the half-buried fragments of fabric, sheets, and plastic liners, precisely the materials you'd find atop a mattress. Deliberate concealment. The boarding house's rear windows stared blankly at these graves, their chipped paint and spiderweb panes mocking the macabre tableau below. Detective Ramirez guided me to the front porch. Neighbors reported foul smells weeks ago, but no one wanted to get involved. Mrs. Patel across the street said she assumed it was rats or old garbage. She frowned. Edgar Puente, Dorothea's housemate, claimed the odors were a busted furnace. He said he'd call a repairman. Nobody thought to check the yard. I scribbled notes as I peered at the brass numbers on the gate. 1426 F Street. This wasn't just one isolated tragedy, it was a pattern unfolding over years, hidden in plain sight. Behind me, a coroner knelt to examine a child-sized shoe, its sole worn thin, a grim reminder of innocence lost. Local news crews lined the street outside, their tripods and microphones blocking the sidewalk. I overheard a reporter ask a neighbor, "How many people lived here?" The woman shook her head. "Too many to count. 8 at last check. All went missing one by one." As I packed up my camera, I felt the gravity of what lay ahead. 8 bodies, plus the housemate's companion, murdered under the same roof, 6 graves already uncovered, more to come. And all of them, victims of someone they trusted under this roof. Dorothea Puente would soon learn that her secrets couldn't stay buried forever. I stepped back for the yellow tape, ready to dig deeper into the story of the missing tenants and the woman who lured them here. Because in Sacramento's foggy dawn, I realized this boarding house was the epicenter of a horror that spanned half a decade, and I was determined to unearth every chilling detail. I dug into the city archives and missing persons bulletins, and a grim pattern emerged. Between 1982 and 1988, 8 residents simply evaporated from 1426 F Street. Each case file began the same way, a check to the welfare office, a call to social services, and then silence. Names like Rosa Delgado, Martin Vega, and 62-year-old Leonard Travis vanished without a trace. No arrests. No suspects. Just blank pages in Sacramento's memory. I stood in the building's dimly lit hallway, flashlight sweeping over faded floral wallpaper and scuffed hardwood floors. Room numbers had been scratched into doors, 201, 202, 203, each door leading to a life that ended in secrecy. At 203, I peered inside. A single mattress on a rusted frame, a plastic chair, a stack of government check stubs neatly pooled on the nightstand. The stubs bore Dorothea Puente's signature as co-guardian, proof that the residents trusted her to cash their assistance checks. Neighbors described the house as a sanctuary for those down on their luck. She'd welcome you in, feed you dinner, one recalled. Dorothea had a soft spot for folks on the edge. But when anyone went missing, she'd explain away the absence. Mr. Vega moved to be closer to his daughter. Ms. Delgado went to stay at her sister's. No one thought to look in the backyard. I tracked down Carmen Reyes, a former tenant who left in 1985 after nearly disappearing herself. Over coffee in a halfway house, she confessed she'd awoken one night to find her roommate gone. Dorothea told me he ran off with a boyfriend, Carmen said, voice trembling. Then 2 days later, he was just gone. She told me not to worry. Carmen shook her head. I started fearing my name on a check was about all that kept me safe. By late afternoon, I had copies of utility bills showing only one name on the electric account, Puente's, despite the constant turnover of renters. I cross-referenced death records and found no trace of the tenants. Their welfare checks, however, were cashed regularly until abruptly stopping, matching the timeline of each disappearance. It painted a chilling picture. Dorothea wasn't just a caretaker, she was the common denominator in every vanishing. Back at my desk, I sketched a timeline. 8 disappearances, 8 signed checks, 8 empty rooms. The house, once a refuge, had become a trap. As dusk settled over Sacramento, I realized the missing tenants were only the beginning. To understand the full horror, I'd have to follow Dorothea's paper trail and confront the twisted motives that turned compassion into carnage. By mid-morning, I'd secured court records, autopsy reports, and even remnants of victims' medical charts, evidence that would expose Dorothea Puente's deadly scheme. She wasn't just luring tenants into her home, she was drugging them to death for their welfare checks. I started at the Sacramento County Coroner's Office, rifling through files on each of the 8 missing residents. Dr. Simon Lee, the county medical examiner, led me to the toxicology results. Each victim's blood contained lethal levels of barbiturates and benzodiazepines, medications Puente could obtain through forged prescriptions or pill mills. In several cases, she had mixed in antihistamines and alcohol to amplify the sedative effects. They looked like overdose victims, Lee told me, but the concentration curves don't fit typical abuse patterns. Someone dosed them intentionally and repeatedly until they stopped breathing. Next, I interviewed Frances Delgado, a former caseworker in the county's Adult Protective Services. Over a late afternoon coffee in a crowded diner, she slid me a stack of welfare check stubs from 1982 to 1988. Each bore Puente's signature, endorsements she signed as co-guardian or responsible party. Clients trusted her, Delgado said. She'd pick up their checks, cash them at the grocery store, and bring back their groceries. No one suspected she'd stop bringing them back at all. Armed with toxicology and financial records, I visited state welfare headquarters to track the flow of assistance dollars. A ledger showed regular deposits totaling nearly $50,000 over 6 years, checks that funded Puente's escalating car payments, utility bills, and lavish dinners at the Sutter Club. It lines up too neatly, a social services auditor told me. Every time a tenant disappeared, a corresponding check was mailed out and cashed. The trail ends at Puente's account. To fill in the gaps, I tracked down Miguel Santos, who lived at 1426 F Street in the summer of 1987. He recounted waking in a haze of disorientation and finding his roommate's bed empty. I took my pills and passed out, he told me. When I woke up, she said I'd been really sick, too sick to work. 2 days later, Santos discovered his own rent money missing. He packed a bag and left, assuming he was in trouble for overdosing. I wish I'd asked more questions, he sighed. By dusk, I had mapped Puente's lethal routine. 1. Recruit vulnerable adults seeking shelter. 2. Administer a cocktail of sedatives, seducing them into false security. 3. Wait for respiratory failure in their locked rooms. 4. Transport bodies in plastic-lined sheets to the backyard's shallow graves. 5. Cash their welfare checks and disappear them from the rolls. That night, I returned to the boarding house and peered through the dusty windows. In the dim hallway, I could almost picture Puente gliding from door to door, dispensing medicine like a benevolent caretaker. But the emptied rooms, stripped of personal effects, told a darker tale of premeditation and greed. Before I left, I stopped at the coroner's van, where detectives bagged more bone fragments. Sweat cooled on my neck under a single flashlight beam. I tucked the ledger photocopies and toxicology summaries into my notebook. Overdose deaths, I muttered, made to look accidental. As I drove back to the Chronicle newsroom, I realized how Dorothea Puente, once trusted and gentle, had weaponized compassion and turned a boarding house into a killing ground. The sky was overcast the morning I joined the Sacramento County Coroner's Office in the Major Crimes Task Force at 1426 F Street. After toxicology exposé, we were ready to see exactly how Dorothea Puente's victims were concealed and finally bring their stories into the light. I ducked under the yellow tape as forensic anthropologists crouched beside 6 shallow graves, neatly lined up like markers on a morbid calendar. Each pit measured just large enough to hold a wrapped body. Dr. Simon Lee lifted a plastic-wrapped bundle from grave 3 and peeled back layers of stained sheet and plastic lining. Inside lay the curled skeleton of Rosa Delgado, her fingers still interlocked over a faded rosary. A small laminated card clipped to the sheet bore her name and the date she disappeared, August 12, 1984. Beside her grave, I spotted the clear imprint of a rolled-up plastic tarp, Puente's makeshift body bag, only partially buried. I knelt to brush away wet leaves and uncovered a rusted hammerhead encrusted with red-brown residue. I bagged it, noting its weight and the deep dents on its striking face, evidence that it wasn't merely a gardening tool, but a weapon of deliberate force. Dr. Lee called me over to grave 6. "Here's where Martin Vega was placed," he said. He uncovered a torn fragment of Vega's flannel shirt, its fibers still clinging to soil. Then he pointed to 2 small puncture wounds on the underside of one rib bone, microscopic grooves consistent with a hypodermic needle. He was injected, sedated, to the point of respiratory failure, then finished off bluntly. I snapped photos as Ramirez directed a tech to lift plaster casts of deeper footprints, wet boot treads imprinting the yard's clay soil. Mixed in were bare, powdered footprints from rubber-soled slippers, likely Puente's house shoes. They led directly from the back door steps to each grave, and then back again, tracing the killer's deliberate route. At the furthest grave, Dr. Lee uncovered a leather wallet fused to the ground. Inside were welfare check stubs, now brittle, checks signed over to Puente just days before the burial. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very documents that funded these lives had become the last testament of their deaths. Nearby, an evidence tech handed me a small Ziploc bag containing a scrap of Dorothea's handwriting, a torn corner of a utility bill with her scrawled signature. It tied her not just to the house, but to the precise week each tenant died. Combine that with her forged prescription pads found in her bedroom desk, and the financial ledgers we uncovered, and the case against her was unassailable. I stepped back to the cabin's rear porch, its boards rotted and scarred. The coroner's lights threw long shadows across the graves, and I could almost see Puente moving between them, methodically repeating her deadly ritual. As I recorded my observations, neighbors peered through fence gaps, shock and vindication on their faces. By sundown, all 6 graves, and 2 more in a discrete cluster, had been catalogued. The final grave, closest to the fence, belonged to Leonard Travis, Dorothea's housemate who had once defended her. His body lay face up, a single bullet hole in the skull, an act of panic or ruined loyalty. That evening, I filed my report, Boarding House Burials. Forensic teams uncover mass graves at F Street, knowing the evidence would leave no room for doubt. Dorothea Montalvo Puente's carefully constructed facade had crumbled under the weight of sheet-wrapped corpses, buried truths, and a reporter's relentless pursuit of justice. By February 1993, Sacramento's historic Superior Court was brimming with spectators. I arrived early, notebook and recorder in hand, slipping past uniformed bailiffs to claim a seat behind the press row. The case of the people versus Dorothea Montalvo Puente had drawn intense local and even national interest. A seemingly kindly house sitter accused of murdering 8 vulnerable adults and burying them in her backyard. The courtroom walls were paneled in dark oak, and sunlight streamed through tall arched windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Dozens of family members sat clustered in the front row, clutching framed photos of their missing loved ones. Across the aisle, Puente stooped, gray-haired, eyes rimmed in dark circles, watched impassively, hands folded on the defense table. Prosecutor Maria Sanchez took the podium first. In a clear, unwavering voice she outlined the prosecution's case. Over 6 years, Ms. Puente betrayed every tenant's trust. She promised shelter, then dosed them with lethal sedatives, bound them in sheets and plastic, and buried their bodies in her own yard in exchange for welfare checks intended to ease their poverty. We will prove her guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Sanchez displayed a photo montage, the intact boarding house facade, the hand-drawn map beneath a placemat, the coroner's evidence bags filled with sheets and bones, and the ledger of welfare check endorsements. Gasps rippled through the gallery as each image appeared. Defense attorney Robert Allen rose for his opening. He framed Puente as a troubled but fundamentally decent woman. Dorothea Montalvo Puente cared for society's forgotten. Yes, some clients died on her watch due to existing health conditions and prescription misuse, but she never intended their deaths. We will show the state's evidence is circumstantial, that many of these so-called murders fit patterns of accidental overdose and untraceable decomposition. The first witness was Dr. Simon Lee, the county medical examiner. He described autopsy results for each victim. All 8 suffered massive central nervous system depression consistent with barbiturate and benzodiazepine overdose. But the dosage curves are inconsistent with self-administration. The bodies were wrapped and buried within days of death, preserving evidence of blunt force trauma in 3 cases. A pattern emerges that matches no natural or accidental scenario. Next, Frances Delgado, the former Adult Protective Services caseworker, testified about Puente's financial records. She presented a timeline of welfare checks cashed at the benefit office, each endorsed by Puente, and deposited into her personal account within 48 hours of a tenant's disappearance. "I trusted her to care for them," Delgado said, voice cracking. "I never imagined she'd steal their checks or their lives." Then came Miguel Santos, the tenant who barely escaped. He described waking in a drugged haze, vomiting on a bedroom floor, and finding his roommate gone. Dorothea said he'd left with a friend. 2 days later, "I saw the grave site being dug through my window. I ran." His testimony drew audible shudders. Prosecutor Sanchez returned for her closing. This was not mercy killing. This was murder for profit. Each layer of plastic, each grave meticulously dug, each check signed. These are the signatures of premeditation. She reminded jurors of the burial site photographs and the survivor's account. Allen countered with appeals to reasonable doubt and his own character witnesses, a parish minister, a neighborhood council member, painting Puente as a last resort guardian, not a killer. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury filed back. The foreperson's voice was steady. "We, the jury, find Dorothea Montalvo Puente guilty on 9 counts of first-degree murder." The courtroom exhaled as Puente's face remained inscrutable. Bailiffs led her away. Judge Harriet Evans scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. Puente faced life without the possibility of parole, an outcome that brought tears of relief to families who had endured a decade of unanswered questions. As I filed my story, caretaker turned killer, jury convicts Dorothea Montalvo Puente, I realized the trial's verdict was more than a legal triumph. It was an affirmation that every disappearance, every uncashed check, and every forgotten plea for help mattered. Nearly 2 decades have passed since Dorothea Montalvo Puente was led away in handcuffs, her life sentence unaltered by age or time. I'm Alex Carter, and in the years since Puente's conviction, I've watched Sacramento and beyond reckon with the horrors she unleashed at 1426 F Street, as well as the reforms her case inspired. The ramshackle boarding house was demolished in 1998, its timbers burned in a modest ceremony attended by law enforcement and the families of Puente's victims. In its place, a memorial garden now blooms. Wildflowers circle a bronze plaque bearing the 8 names: Delgado, Vega, Travis, and the rest, those who'd trusted Puente's care. Neighbors, once too fearful to speak, now gather annually for a silent vigil beneath the California live oaks, laying white roses upon the plaque. Puente's profit-driven mercy, as prosecutors aptly called it, exposed gaping holes in social services oversight. Within a year of her sentencing, California tightened regulations for adult care facilities, mandatory fingerprinting for all live-in caretakers, quarterly audits of welfare check disbursements, and unannounced inspections of group homes. The state legislature also required that any changes to utility accounts trigger an automatic alert to Adult Protective Services, closing the loophole Puente exploited when she quietly moved the electric and water bills into her name. Puente spent her final years in the Central California Women's Facility at Chowchilla. Interviews with former guards reveal a frail, unrepentant inmate who spent her days reading religious tracts and writing letters to supporters who still clung to her narrative of innocence. She died of natural causes on June 27, 2011, aged 82. No public funeral was held. Her remains were cremated, her ashes unclaimed. In death as in life, she left more questions than answers, particularly in the hearts of those who wondered how a seemingly compassionate woman could harbor such cruelty. The Puente case resonates still in an era when vulnerability can be both a path to care and a gateway to exploitation. I often recall Carmen Reyes, the tenant who escaped, reminding me how easily fear silences suspicion. "I thought she was helping me," she said, tears in her eyes. Today's caregivers are now subject to background checks that Puente never faced. Families vet live-in aides via state registries, and modern wellness visits ensure someone always sees aging or at-risk adults in their homes. As I drive past F Street now, the old boarding house is gone, replaced by new homes where laughter and life echo. Yet whenever I hear about reform saving someone from neglect or catching a potential abuser early, I remember Dorothea Puente's legacy, the darkest extremes of misplaced trust, and the determination of a community and a reporter to shine light into the deepest shadows. Justice was served in the courtroom, but it's in these policy changes, memorials, and the vigilant eyes of neighbors that Puente's victims truly live on. And as long as I report stories like theirs, I carry their memories with me, ever mindful that compassion, when unchecked, can be twisted into unimaginable horror.